And our first speaker is Dr. Dominick DellaSala. He's President and Chief Scientist of the Geos Institute in Ashland, Oregon, and former President of the Society for Conservation Biology, North America. He's an internationally renowned author of over 200 publications on forest ecology, endangered species, conservation biology, and climate change. Dominick has given keynote talks ranging from academic conferences to the United Nations Earth Summit. He's been featured in hundreds of news stories and documentaries, testified in the U.S. Congress, co-founded organizations, and has received conservation leadership and book writing awards. He is on the editorial board of Elsevier, Earth Science and Environmental Sciences, co-editor of the Encyclopedia of the Anthropocene and the world's biomeans, and editor of several scientific journals. Dominick is motivated by his work to leave a living planet for his daughters, grandkids, and all that follow. And so we are patching into Dominick.
All right, excellent. Okay, well, hi everybody. I'm so sorry I can't be there in person, but the good part of this presentation is that I'm not emitting any carbon by driving to the coast tonight. I'm actually doing this in my living room with a glass of wine, nice and relaxed. I always love to go to the coast. It's one of my favorite places to go to, and again, apologies for not being there in person and not being able to hear you. But we'll go ahead and hopefully this will all work out and you'll get a little bit of the background as to why forests are really important to our climate. And the newest discoveries that we are finding out about forests is that they really do hold the keys to our climate future. And we've known for a long time that forests are really important from a biodiversity standpoint and from a water standpoint. And I'm going to share some exciting discoveries with you tonight about why they are so vital to Oregon's climate future. So here we go. And so I wanted to just kind of give the basic science behind the greenhouse effect that you probably are well aware of. And the solar radiation that comes into our planet that's necessary for all life on Earth is really what keeps us warm. It gets trapped by our atmosphere, particularly the composition of the atmosphere, which includes carbon. And so if we didn't have that atmosphere, the heat energy would just bounce off back into space, which some of it does, but much of it is trapped by the Earth's surface, and it allows us to live in this optimal climate that we're currently in. However, you can have too much of a good thing. And so this is just a cartoon schematic of all the ways that we are pumping carbon into the atmosphere, mostly through the use of fossil fuels. And the byproduct, of course, is the release of carbon and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, which is what you can see in that illustration there. So many ways that carbon gets into the atmosphere and pushes the count up above what is now considered the safety level for carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, which is why the planet is warming. And notice that down in the lower left-hand part of the screen there, you see the loss of forest, and we'll talk about that in my presentation in terms of what's been happening in the forest and how they can either contribute to the solution or the amplification of the climate greenhouse effect. So, I mean, now first the bad news, and I spend a lot of my time working on climate forecasting models, and I'm currently one of the reviewers of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC for short. And the latest projections as downscaled for Oregon are looking something like this. So what you see there is the temperature that has been oscillating over time since the early 1900s. It bounces up and down, and then with the buildup of greenhouse gases because we know there's a relationship between those gases and temperature. You can see where it's headed. And the latest projections show a pretty dire situation in Oregon, with the top end projections showing a 14-degree Fahrenheit increase potentially occurring by the end of this century. So that's in the lifetime of our great-grandkids, if you choose to have kids. They will be dealing with these consequences. The figure on the right that you see there is what happened in 2015 when the state of Oregon was mostly in drought, almost the entire state, in fact. And some of the climate projections are showing increased drought conditions in the state, and as we now know, those conditions are coupled with increased fire activity, which is what we've been witnessing in much of the West over the last several years. So unless we do something to get carbon out of the atmosphere, this is what the future is, which is a pretty dire situation on the coast. Of course, it's sea level rise. Okay, so now some basic photosynthesis. For those of you that had intro to biology, this is, the forest connection to climate security. It's how carbon enters the forest. And so all plants, particularly trees, take in sunlight through the process of photosynthesis. They absorb carbon dioxide and make their food energy, giving us oxygen in return. And so they store that excess carbon dioxide that they get from the atmosphere as carbon. And in forests, that carbon, a lot of it is stored in the massive trees, the ancient forests that we have, and the very productive soils. And there's some statistics there that I left you with on the bottom of the screen there. And a single acre of temperate rainforest has 1 billion leaves. That's a giant carbon sponge sitting out there in the forest, absorbing a lot of that atmospheric carbon and helping to stabilize our climate. Unfortunately, this is the current situation that we're in. So forests can either be part of the solution, if they look more like the old growth forest on that part of your screen, or they could be part of the problem if they look like this kind of logged over landscape, like on the Tongass rainforest in Alaska. Now the good news is that the Paris Climate Change Agreement, which was signed by all nations, except President Trump has recently rescinded from that agreement, it calls action on the part of the world governments to conserve and enhance their carbon sinks and reservoirs. So those are forests. That's language for forests. I like to call them climate sanctuaries instead of sinks. Sinks is kind of a jargon term, so think of them as sanctuaries for the climate and how they're going to keep our thermostat from overheating. And not all forests are created equally. This is a slide from some work that I published with Oregon State forest carbon experts back in 2014. It shows the areas of the country in green where the forests have the highest density of carbon. These are the older, mature forests that are very productive, the wet forests that can hold on to carbon for long periods of time. So any carbon or climate solution needs to enlist these forests in our climate security. And if you look at the equivalent amount of carbon being stored in those forests, it's equivalent to about 7 times the total US emissions. So we need to cut our emissions, but at the same time, we also need to be protecting these forests that hold the keys to our climate security. So here's a breakdown of some of the most carbon-dense national forests. These are the top 25. Notice several of them are from our state of Oregon. And also notice the Tongass at the bottom from there. That happens to be the nation's biggest climate sanctuary. The color you see in black is the area protected. The shading in gray is not protected. So there's a lot of carbon out there that could be in protected areas that currently isn't. And I actually have to revise this now that we have President Trump's proposal to enter the Tongass roadless areas for old growth logging. So that's an unfortunate set of circumstances that's taking us in the opposite direction of climate security. Closer to home in Oregon, again, I did this with a number of different scientists at Oregon State University back in 2014. The map you see there are Oregon's carbon-dense forest. And notice that one statistic there, that older forests store about 10 times the amount of carbon as younger forests like plantations. So we really need to kind of start relying on our older forests to help us get through this coming climate change storm that we're headed for. Now, the Northwest Forest Plan was really important in making our forest, or shifting our forest from a source rather of emissions to a sink. Now, for some reason on my screen, there's one line missing on the private that you see on that graph. But what that graph is showing is that in the 1980s, and I guess it doesn't show up on my screen, but in the 1980s, to the left of that linear line, the forests, both on public and private lands, were operating as a source of emissions because of all the logging. And that vertical line you see is when the Northwest Forest Plan kicked in. And you can see how the forest then shifted from a source of emissions to a sink or sanctuaries. And also you can see in that graph, and I apologize, the dates don't show up on my screen, but public forests have a lot more carbon than private lands do. Private lands are also doing their share, but not as much as public lands. And the colors that you see in that one big schematic there, the green are public forest, the red are private forest, throughout the range of the northern spotted owl that is covered by the Northwest Forest Plan. Okay, so just wanted to explain a little bit about how carbon enters and leaves the forest. You can think of the forest as a big bucket, and the bucket is porous. It's got holes in it. So carbon, those little C molecules you see there, go into the forest, and the forest does its job, the photosynthesis, storing that carbon, and then it loses carbon through respiration, natural disturbance events like fires, and logging of the forest. And if we really want to have forests do an even better job, we got to plug as many of those holes that we can as possible. The other key difference that you see from this slide is the size of the bucket. And so those are historic photographs of what our forests were once like, the size of those old growth trees. The old growth we have now is a lot smaller in size compared to what was taken. And the landscape that you see there shrunk the size of the bucket. So we have smaller buckets now that are storing less carbon, even though they are a sink for carbon. The bucket's a lot smaller. So we need to make that bucket bigger by doing restoration and protecting the existing older forests that are carbon dense. I just wanted to point out that we lost a lot of carbon to the atmosphere, and that carbon will stay up in the atmosphere for over 100 years. It's got a long hang time. So the logging that took place prior to World War II, that carbon is still up in the atmosphere. It doesn't go away. So here's how carbon leaves the forest. And there are many different pathways in terms of when a forest is logged. It enters the wood supply chain. It goes into wood products. Some of those go into high quality products like structural lumber and veneer. And a chunk of it goes into pulp and paperboard. And so a couple of things to note here. When a forest is logged, if it's an old forest, up to 2/3 of the carbon is emitted right back up into the atmosphere. It depends on the intensity of the logging and the age of the forest. Now, the remaining carbon is what we call embodied or entombed in wood products, if you will. And that has a differential lifespan. In the high quality wood products like buildings, it can last for decades. In paper, it can last for maybe a few years before it decays rapidly in landfill. So about 30% of the embodied carbon is in high quality wood products. The rest of it is in fast decaying products that go into landfills. So, you know, you can store some carbon in wood pools like buildings, but it has a very short lifespan compared to the carbon stored in the older forest that it came from. So just some things to keep in mind about where carbon goes when we take it out of the forest. Also, you've heard a lot about thinning. Carbon also leaves the forest from thinning. A lot of fuel treatments going on in our region, and they may or may not stop fire spread. It depends on a lot of factors. Even logging small diameter trees can have limited effects. It can or may not reduce fire intensity, and even so, if it is effective, more carbon leaves the forest from landscape thinning than wildfires. And here's why. So this is based on some of the work that the Oregon Global Warming Commission just released, and I was on the task force that helped advise on this report. And you hear a lot about forest fires emitting carbon, and you know, it looks like they do. When you look at that photograph, it's wow. Looks like a lot of carbon is going into the atmosphere, but in reality, much of that is water vapor and some black carbon or soot that has very short residence time in the atmosphere, weeks, and then it's gone. But the emissions coming from those fires, on average, is about 5% of the state's total emissions. Most years, 1 to 3%. In very active fire years, like we just had, about 9%. So logging emissions, by far, are the bigger concern for reducing emissions compared to forest fires, which have a much smaller effect on the leaky bucket. So here are some ways to plug the leaky bucket as recommended by scientists at Oregon State University in their recent paper, Bev Law and Company. We could do reforestation with native plants. We could do afforestation, which refers to planting fast-growing trees in fallowed agricultural fields. We could reduce logging, such as on federal lands, and we can increase the time between successive logging operations. Currently, on average, on private industrial lands, it's about 35 years in Oregon. The recommendations are to at least double that period, which would sequester and store carbon over a much longer time, contributing to climate solutions rather than climate problems. So this kind of forestry we all know about. We've seen it on our landscape. It needs to be changed if we're going to have a secure climate. I took this photograph on my way back from Portland during the summer, headed towards the Rogue Basin where I live. You can see the preponderance of clear cuts, that's smoke in the background. We now know that fires burn most intensely in this kind of landscape when they encounter plantations and logging slash. So this is a fire unsafe and a climate unsafe landscape that needs to be restored and enlisted in climate solutions. Okay, so I'm about to wrap up, and again, I mentioned I'm one of the technical reviewers on the IPC report that will be coming out very soon. And the startling findings are that the world has 12 years to reduce its emissions by half if we're going to avoid broad damages to society, human health, agricultural production, and all our institutions. So basically, we have a ticking climate time bomb. Forests will help determine how bad or how good it becomes. They're the only large-scale proven way to remove large amounts of atmospheric carbon, but there are limits to what forests can do. There are limits to what the oceans can do. We've really got to cut down on the burning of fossil fuel emissions and the other contributing factors to climate change from our human activities. So here's my schematic for how to change the world in 12 years and to avoid runaway climate change. To get the climate security, I'm advising that we leave the dinosaur carbon in the ground and we absorb more of the atmospheric carbon in ecosystems, particularly forests. If we do that, we get these other benefits. We get biodiversity, we get all kinds of ecosystem services like clean water, recreation, pollination, all the factors that we associate with forests. Take an ecosystem stress pill, means that every time we add stressors to the ecosystem, like logging, mining, grazing, ORVs, we push those ecosystems beyond thresholds, and their capacity to help in climate solutions will be diminished. Get connected refers to connecting the landscape so that wildlife can move around in search of climate sanctuaries. Every time we log or build roads or dams, we block wildlife migrations. And plug that leaky bucket through restoration and longer timber rotations. And so these are some of the things that conservation groups are talking about. Oregon Wild is involved in this, Sierra Club, a group of organizations that have banded together called Stand for Forest, international groups like INTACT, which are focused on protecting the world's primary unlocked forest as climate solutions, and Geos Institute and others are all involved in this. And you can find information on this on the web, but I'll turn it back over to Jason. Hey, you're welcome.
Make that change.